Refresh. Refresh. Good. Well, welcome everybody. I really appreciate all of you who tune in on this particular live stream, but also for all the people who watch later and who make comments. Thank you for the questions that have come in and the subjects that you'd like me to address. I appreciate all that. And just a reminder that you can listen to any of these sorts of teaching sessions or live streams as podcasts on Spotify. You can also find them on YWAM TV on Facebook. You can find them on my website, which is lynngreen.blog or .net or .org. Where else are we talking about, Tiago? Well, there are a lot of different platforms where you can listen to it and watch. And I appreciate Tiago and Eduardo and Paulo who helped me with all this work. And you may think, am I actually doing this from Brazil? Because all these Brazilian names? No, they all live here in England with us, and it's a great blessing to have the Brazilians with us. Which reminds me, actually, I have a whole series, if you haven't seen them, of interviews and impressions from the Send in Brazil, which now we have the figures in. Actually, the figures of the number of people who attended are much higher than they thought at the time. They had 190,000 people. I was just having a quick review of my interview with Lauren just before he went on stage. That's a really good interview, and it does illustrate that with his wide background and what I know, we don't know of anything like this before in the world. It was a really historic event. So have a look at those. I interviewed, I think, 8 or 10, 12 different people whilst there, and a few shots of the crowd and all. So do enjoy that. I want to talk to you about leadership teams today. And I have a few observations to make just broadly. Firstly, Jesus trained a team, and he left a team in place. And we might think, well, yeah, Jesus was unique about a number of things, absolutely. But his leaving of a team in place to be the initial group of leadership of the church was really intentional. I have no doubt about that. And then if you go on into the epistles, you see that when Paul and then Timothy and Titus, the people he commissioned, went out to appoint leadership in the fledgling churches, the ones that they'd just planted a few months before. They didn't appoint a leader, they appointed teams, they appointed elders. And then in Jerusalem, you see, they had the apostles were in charge. It was a team. And when the work got to be too much for them, they appointed other leaders. And sometimes they were leaders of the practical issues of finances and the logistics, and those were deacons. And sometimes they were the people who had the overall spiritual leadership. So I want to talk about both today, but as a general observation would say that the idea of team leadership is not easily grasped in the context of most cultures, so therefore by most people. The idea of team leadership doesn't really work. I didn't understand it. I thought it didn't work when I first heard about it because, well, it was a long time ago. I think it was 75 or 76. It might have been a little later. But a wonderful prophetic teacher, one of the foundation layers of YWAM was Ken Wright, a civil engineer from New Zealand who led a church. And he came one time, I respected him so much because he always had the word of the Lord. And he came one time with this word for YWAM. He said, I've got a word for all of YWAM, and it's about team leadership. And what I heard him say was team, which I understood but had no experience with in leadership. It was always a pastor in charge or a director in charge, and quite hierarchical. But then he talked about co-equal leadership, and I really didn't get that. I'm pretty sure I misunderstood what he was saying at the time, because what that brought in my imagination or understanding was that we would have a team where everybody was equally responsible for everything, and that doesn't work. That's just a surefire recipe for conflict when you have different people making different decisions for the same area of responsibility. So I didn't get it, and I didn't find a way to implement it for probably 6 or 7 years, and I needed the help of a good psychologist for a period of some weeks a team building psychologist. He wasn't actually my psychiatrist setting me right, although he did set me right on a few things. But to implement it, I just needed some really knowledgeable help, because I didn't know how to make it work. So here are some of the things that I struggled with at the time. We're talking about the work growing at a time when there was a move of God called the Jesus movement, the Jesus revolution. It's kind of like what's going on today, what the Send suggests, and that is that there are a lot of people coming into missions, and we were like that then. So we grew quickly, and we grew from mostly new converts. And I kept praying, and Marty and I kept lamenting the fact that we didn't have mature leaders coming to us, and I kept praying that God would send me leaders. But here's the thing about that. If mature leaders come to you, they probably will not come to help you lead what you are leading, which feels too much for you, and you're wanting to share the load. If they're mature leaders, they will tend to come with their own vision. And YWAM is a really great platform for that. YWAM is a good context for people to do what God has called them to do. There are some caveats to that, some things I'd say to be careful about, but I won't get diverted on that. But if you really want to be able to share the load, it's much more likely that you're going to have to develop a leadership team rather than having experienced and mature leaders join you. So how do you do that? Well, I can tell you some things you don't do, because I didn't do some of the most important things and did some wrong things. One is that was a time in YWAM where we hadn't really established discipleship training schools yet. We were doing schools of evangelism, and we didn't have that requirement that people do YWAM training before they came into YWAM full-time. So the result of that is that we had people from varying backgrounds, and people who came in with some leadership skills often came with different values, different understanding of the ways of God, and we didn't fit very well. So to give you an example, I had some really outstanding leaders join me after 6 or 7 years in being here in England, and they were not comfortable with certain bits of YWAM teaching. And I thought, oh, well, they'll get used to it. But for example, because of their different approach to the gifts of the Spirit and to prayer and all, they didn't like to pray like I was used to praying in YWAM. And so I couldn't get them to come and pray. I couldn't get them into any kind of leadership meeting. So we were a leadership team, but we didn't meet, and we didn't pray. And we just had different areas of responsibility. And the result of that was very little unity and very little coordination between the different aspects of what we were doing. So I learned through that you have to have enough common understanding of the ways of God and what He's called us to do that you can pray together and you can meet together. It's great to have good friendships, and I had really good friendships with those guys, but you need more than that. And when you get together, you need to be able to pray freely and share openly and honestly with one another, knowing that you've got a good confidential environment in which personal and private things will stay personal and private and not leave the room. So it takes a while. And I must say, when you're first starting and you're starting a team and it's beginning to grow and you're getting more people coming, it's really important that you look for people who seem like they are capable of taking responsibility. I found as a general rule that if people are wanting leadership and wanting authority, they better demonstrate that they're really responsible equally or first. It's great when a person just is happy to take responsibility and do what needs to be done, and they're not looking for a position or a title or any kind of role, but just like taking responsibility. Then that's the sort of person you want to bring into a developing leadership team. And I think leadership teams develop best by leaving it informal and not announced or made official in any way to start with, so that you just bring people alongside and you get them to work with you to take responsibility for different things. But remember, when you do that, don't give people responsibility with no authority, because you put them in a really difficult position, because certainly some people who are on your team or on your training base or whatever are going to say, well, who are you to tell me to do that? So if you give someone responsibility, those whom they will interact with need to know that you've done that, and that they are not just doing it off their own authority and in their own name. There's also something else I find is difficult for many of us. In some ways, the more detailed you are and the more thoughtful you are, and you know, the more intellectual you are, the more intelligent you are, the more you will tend to have expectations that are really detailed. And if you are like that, and you know you like things done just so, then you really have to have a lot of self-discipline. Because when you give away a lot of self-discipline, responsibility, you can describe to people what you want them to do, but don't get too detailed, because they need to do it in the way that they're most comfortable. What you're looking for is the right outcome, not necessarily the right method of doing things. And I still find myself visiting places, talking to people, and surprised that some people in leadership still don't get how demoralizing it is for those who have been given responsibility and then get overruled. So, you know, you're responsible for this area of, say, maintenance of the grounds or maintenance of the vehicles or something, and then the leader of the overall work comes in and says, no, not that way, do it this way. And it just gets demoralizing. And in the end, what most people do in those circumstances is they quietly bow out of the responsibility, trying to keep their heads down, and then eventually will leave, because none of us like to stay in a place where we don't feel like we are valued. So it makes it really difficult. But we're talking about how you form a team. And how you form a team, I think, usually is you start giving people, kind of experimentally, giving them leadership responsibilities, letting them work with it, meeting with them, praying about their responsibilities and seeing how it's going. And gradually, a team begins to form. Now, that's when a work is just being pioneered. But for many of you who are watching this, you're in a ministry, and especially in a YWAM team, maybe it's a base that's been in existence for decades. So how do you keep a good team going? Well, firstly, let's just reiterate that Jesus left a team. Some people think, well, no, he left Peter in charge, and they look at John 21 and his exhortation, "Feed my sheep," and the fact that Peter was the spokesman on the day of Pentecost. But actually, that evidence is too flimsy. You can't say Peter was overall in charge, because when it comes to the real important decision-making of Acts 15, James was leading the meeting. James articulated the decision that the meeting had made and how they were going to implement it. So what I think Jesus really left in place was a team, not where one person was overall responsible, but nor a team where everybody was responsible for everything. But it was a mature team. It was a team where they had come to know one another's abilities, skills, ministry gifts, and people came to the front to lead when their particular gifting and calling was the appropriate one. So sure enough, for public declaration, for evangelism, Peter seemed to be the guy. But then when it came to leadership decisions, it seemed like James was, and you see how even the deacons were really responsible for major things and took significant roles. So An ideal team is one that recognizes that every one of the ministry gifts is needed. There needs to be pastoral people. There needs to be teaching elders and evangelists and people who are prophetic. We really do need prophetic giftings in our leadership teams. But it's not often a good idea that a highly prophetic person leads the team, because it tends to be more impulsive and doesn't have the continuity that someone with a more apostolic gift brings. And by apostolic, I mean something that is not nearly as grandiose as the term is often used. It just means several things, but one of the main things is someone who sees where the other gifts fit, the ability to make room for others, understand what others are called to, and get everybody operating in the things that they're good at. And as far as possible, not requiring people to operate in things they're not good at, although you have to at times out of just simple servant-heartedness. If I go back to one other thing about how well we perceive the idea of team leadership, cultures vary a lot, and I'm quite aware that I live in a European culture. They're all different from one another, but as such, I live in a context in which I think team leadership is probably more readily understood than in many other cultures, certainly more so than in my American background. Surprisingly, given how the U.S. government is set up and all the rest, most of the time, Americans develop quite a hierarchical system where there's a senior pastor or a senior director, and everybody's under them, and there are 2 or 3 layers, and that seems normal and seems how things work the best. And you could argue that certain ways that does work the best. But when you have a team that's really working in unity, and you have the different perspectives and the different opinions and the different ministry gifts involved in your decision making, I think in the long run it becomes a much more healthy thing. Lauren kind of understood that intuitively as early as 1972, right after the Olympic Games in Munich. He appointed an international council, and that was a team of leaders to help the overall oversight and leadership of YWAM. And we've worked with a team ever since. That's a long time. It's moving towards 50 years, isn't it? And yet, in some ways, that's easier to do with a group of leaders who don't live together. They live in the far-flung parts of the world, and they come together a couple of times or 3 times a year, and they parcel out responsibility because you're not really interfacing with each other every day. I think the job of setting up a leadership team in an existing YWAM team or community or base or a church or any other organization is a bigger challenge, because it's when you're working together day to day. And in many YWAM centers like this training campus, you're not just working together 40 hours a week, you're working and living together. You're together, your lives are intertwined all the time. And that's a better environment for discipleship, you might call it. That's an environment where we really need to develop deep unity, because we're impacting one another's lives down to a level of detail that's really unusual in church. But it should be more normal. In a way, you might say that nations and cultures all have within them a certain understanding of how hierarchical leadership is, or how much it's team-based, woven into their culture. And I find that most of the countries in the world that tend to have, say, military dictators or presidents for life, or whatever it is, where there's one man at the top who is kind of the final word, I find that mostly the churches and the organizations in those countries work that way. And that's not to say it's wrong. That's not to say it's sinful. It's just that in the long run, it's not going to be as fruitful. And it also oftentimes it makes it more difficult for people under that leadership because you just have one final word. And it's always good to have appeal opportunities and just better perspectives on any issues where there's any kind of disagreement or conflict. So think about your own setting. Do you find the idea of team leadership easy to comprehend because you've seen it a lot in your culture or society? Or is that difficult to understand? It's difficult for me because, well, my background, the pastor was always the final word, and the teacher and the business owner. So it was very much a hierarchical setup with a person at the top. And that takes some unlearning. It took quite a lot of unlearning for me, still does. You have to learn to listen. Even if you are the senior person in the setup, I usually have been because of pioneering the work here and still being here after 50 years. It takes a lot of continuing to learn to listen and to hold opinions lightly until they've been well examined and put through a team process. It takes the patience of being able to bring key decisions to the table so the whole team can look at it. And that's not to say all decisions come. I think one of the real arts in any leadership team is to work out how much authority does each member have in their area of responsibility. If you've got somebody leading a management team, for example, but they're on the leadership team as well, how much of the managerial decisions have to come to the leadership team and how much can stay out there in his or her realm of responsibility with that team. Now, I'm saying his or her responsibility with that team, which implies a hierarchy, but when I talk in that way, what I mean really is like the James picture in Acts 15. There will always be somebody who is best, and there may be 2 or 3 people who are good at leading meetings. They may not be the best at evangelistic preaching or the best at teaching, but they're really good at leading the meetings. And those are different functions. So it's really good when those are shared around. But for every team, it needs to be clear who's in charge of any particular meeting, who's leading this meeting. Now, if I refer to our Founders Circle, which is now our sort of, it's a senior eldership team. It's not the final word on everything. It's primarily looking after the values and making sure that we are getting together from time to time. But on that team, we find that different people take responsibility for drawing the meetings together, setting up the agenda, and chairing every time we meet. And it'll maybe the same person will do it 2, 3, 4 times in a row, but then we do move it around because that way various people get the opportunity to develop. And we didn't do that at the beginning. At the beginning, and I was the chairman say in the early 2000s, and that meant I chaired all the meetings, and I took over from Jim Steyer, who'd been chairing the meetings for 10 years, and that was where our understanding was at the time. But I think as a team matures more, you can see that different responsibilities can be handed off to different people. It just needs to be clear. Now, if we move on from that a little bit and think about how our leadership teams appointed, it'll be really helpful because, if people are comfortable that the right people are on a team, half the battle is won, If they feel, oh, that person should be on that team, or none of those people should be on that team, then you really have a difficult task. So if we think about that scripturally, we can come up with some pretty good guidelines. But first, just to remind you, I've talked about how to develop a team, and that's different. But once you have a team, how do you appoint new people to that? How do people step down and so on? I think in the YWAM context, people step down because there's a fair amount of fluidity, and a person may be in a place for 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years, but the norm is that they do move on. So when you need new leadership team members, what do you do? Well, back to Scripture again. I think if you look at Paul's instructions to Timothy or his instructions to Titus, which are very similar, you'll find that there is an implied process there with the local people. It's not explicit. It doesn't say, first of all, Timothy, consult with the people, but it says you look for people of good reputation. Now, you don't know who's of good reputation unless you are in tune with and asking questions of the local people who will be impacted by that leader. So I found, and we've been replenishing leadership teams now for some decades, found that you need a consultation process. It doesn't have to be thorough. It's not a voting process, but somehow you need to ask the question in a way that is culturally appropriate for you. Ask the question of the people: who do you respect? Who do you honor? Who do you feel comfortable with? Because that's what Paul was looking for, or had Timothy and Titus look for, in the churches, people of good reputation, who were husbands of one wife in that case, rather than polygamous, whose households were in order, who were not given to drunkenness. They were hospitable and so on. So we're talking about character, and there's no doubt about it that character is just a whole lot more important than personality. And sometimes we get, is seduced the right word? Fooled, at least, by people with really strong personalities and good communication skills, and we think, oh, there's a good leader. And especially if you see them out of their context and they're socially at ease and they're a good communicator and all, real tendency to think, now there's a person with leadership gifts. Well, not necessarily. Oftentimes, quieter people, shy people, those who don't stand out immediately, but who have outstanding character, are the people who others really trust. Because in the end, we all feel comfortable trusting someone who we know tells the truth, for example. We know is not fleshly. They're not in any way seductive, or they're not a show-off. They're not a braggart. So character is just a crucial thing, and the way you find out how people are viewed as far as their character goes is by consulting with the people. So for the last many years where I've been involved, a leadership appointment usually begins with some process of nomination. Who do you trust? And have people write down the top 2 or 3 names or whatever. And then whoever is on that team or putting that team together can look and say, okay, here are the 5 most trusted people by the community. Now let's pray over these. But you also want to think not only who's trusted, but what kind of skills do we need on this team? Do we need somebody who really has a strong intercession gift and prophetic? Then let's say that to our team or community and say, who would you recommend? We find that we have a need in this area. Do you need an administrator? Do you need someone who's really good for interacting with YWAM internationally more widely, or with your, if you're not in YWAM, your denomination or the senior leadership? So you think about what are the gaps in our team, and who is trusted by the people to do that. Then I find that usually the next step is to take all those names before the Lord, talk about it with whatever core of leadership is still there, and then ask the Lord, who do you want? And pick that person. It's often most healthy to expand a leadership team 1 or 2 people at a time. You can disrupt and sidetrack a team if you add too many people at once. So those are some broad guidelines, and I want to finish with a couple of specific questions that people ask. Somebody asked a very good question. What do you think about husbands and wives both serving on a leadership team? And the answer is that I think a lot about that. I can't say yes or no on that because it varies so much. If you have a strong team and a husband and wife are, they have very different personalities and very different views, and they're both really mature and respected by the community, it will work. And in another instance, I know of couples where they are so complementary. One is maybe very pastoral, the other very prophetic or apostolic, but they're really, they each have their own mind. They don't vote as a block or come with processed opinions where they're of the same opinion. Then that will work too. What's difficult is where the couple in question come as a voting block, as it were. I don't mean to imply that we vote on a lot of things, but they come with a strongly held position that they hold together, and it makes it difficult for everyone else. I think there's a common misunderstanding that Lauren and Dar led together. In the early days, it was not unusual for Lauren to leave Dar responsible when he was away, but as soon as possible, she pulled someone else in, and as soon as possible after that, she stepped out of the direct leadership and focused on being a mother. And she was for a long time. And then it was only when the children were grown that it was like you could almost see the real leadership anointing that Dar has intrinsically come back on her, and she began to lead again in really clear ways. But they haven't often led together in the same locale because they're both very strong people. And they either have very similar opinions and they come as kind of a block that's hard to resist, or they have very different opinions and the leadership team becomes a place that is a little uncomfortable because of a lot of disagreement between the spouses. So I wouldn't say yes, it's fine for them to lead, a couple to lead together on a team. I wouldn't say no, that shouldn't happen. I would say in some situations it's really right. In some situations it can go badly wrong. So I think rather than trying to find an overarching rule on this, you have to think through what are the specifics to this team and this couple, because it might work. And on the other hand, it could cause conflict. Final question is somebody asked, and a question that will arise more, I think, and that is, what do you think of sabbaticals? Well, I think sabbaticals can be really helpful, and they can also be very disruptive. So it's important to find your place of rest by faith in God all the time so you don't get burned out. And that's a whole subject in itself, isn't it? But I think many times people want sabbaticals because they're just so tired. And that pattern of getting really worn out and needing a long break is not a good pattern. So better, I'm not saying it's wrong to take a sabbatical. By all means, some people, you're just going to have to. But look at the underlying issues. What is it? Where do you need the help to not be overwhelmed? Sabbaticals are most common in the academic world because academics will often take a year out to do research and to enhance their knowledge of their field of endeavor and teaching. So we're different than that. And I personally have not ever really felt a need for a sabbatical as such. After about, I think it was after 40 years, Marty and I said we were going to take a break. We took 6 months, partly because we just felt it was time to change our responsibilities. But remember, when you take a sabbatical, you have to lay your responsibility and authority down. And that means somebody has to pick it up. And you can't expect that you just come back and pick it all up again and maybe start changing the things that didn't go the way you wanted while you were gone. That doesn't work very well. That causes quite a lot of disruption. So I'm not against sabbaticals at all, but I think it's best to do a sabbatical when you know a time of change is coming and it gives you the chance to sort of refuel and prepare for the new responsibilities, and it gives you a chance to give responsibility to others that you really are giving them, and then you start your sabbatical as a process of change. I think that could work really well. But if it becomes a norm, then it will really hit our effectiveness, because you can't be in a key leadership role and then just walk away from it for a year and come back like nothing happened. Things will really change, and by and large, if you're leading in an area of significant responsibility, before you can take that kind of break, you have to have somebody who can do an excellent job of replacing you, and then you come back to something else. So those are just a few thoughts around leadership teams. I've rushed through them because this is meant to be a half hour, and it's about a half hour now, a little bit more. I hope that's helpful. If you have questions on that, I'd be happy to come back on another live stream and answer a few questions. I won't always do an entire live stream on one subject, so I can come and address something for 5 or 10 minutes and then move on to another subject. So I would welcome any comments, any disagreements. If there's a statement you'd like me to read out where you take exception, I might agree with you in the end. But I really value feedback of all kinds, agreement, questions, asking me to expand on things, so we just keep these series going. But thank you very much for being in on this. And remember, you can access this as a video or as a podcast, and you can also read my blogs on my blog at lynngreen.net blog or org. Thanks again.